series Story Time. Last week we began, and since most of you weren't here, I will repeat, we began to look at the story of the prodigal son. And I'm going to give you just a minute to groan and sigh, because if you've been in church any length of time at all, you've heard at least probably a dozen sermons on the prodigal son. And you may think you know it all by now, and maybe you do. But we're looking at the prodigal son in a little bit different light, because the curiosity is how do we read it versus how did the listeners that were hearing it from Jesus understand it? And I think you'll find it's two different things as we look at this. If you want to catch up on last week's, I don't have time to go back over everything, but if you want to catch up on last week's, it is on YouTube with a link through our Hey Ty Facebook page. But the whole point of this is that this is on the heels. When we started our series Story Time, we started with the parable of the lost sheep. This story of what we call the prodigal son is on the heels of that. In response to the Pharisees saying that this man sits with sinners and tax collectors, Jesus related three parables. The first was the parable of the lost sheep. The second was the parable of the lost coin. And the third was the prodigal son, what we call the prodigal son. And we discussed last week how this may be misnamed. Really, we've come to understand it because in Christian circles for a long time, everyone has focused on the bad son who ran away and came back. But that's not really what this story is about. That's part of it, but there's a lot more to it. It probably would have been better aptly named the running father or the loving father or something to that aspect, and we'll get to that in a minute. But because the story is long, I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. The setting of the story, because this particular one, as I said, is being told in front of both the Pharisees and the sinners and tax collectors that Jesus was eating with. And that's significant, as we talked about last week, because there was a Jewish custom called table fellowship. And in table fellowship, whoever you were willing to sit down and eat publicly with was a covenant between you and them. It stated that I am one of you, and if you ever need me, I'll be there. And this is why the Pharisees were so upset with Jesus when he publicly sat with these people, because this rabbi, this teacher of the law, was associating himself with sinners and tax collectors. The Pharisees were standing there, but they were standing close enough to see, but not close enough to be associated with that. And then Jesus begins his stories to illustrate a point. Now, we have often thought of this, and as we say, called the parable of the prodigal son. But truthfully, it is more of a story of a dysfunctional family. It is about a father with two sons. The plot revolves around this family, not any one of the sons, but the whole group. And during that time, as Jesus began to tell the story, everyone that would have heard it would have been completely and utterly shocked by what Jesus was saying. First of all, for a son, especially a younger son, to go to his father and say, I want my inheritance now, was unheard of. Because in Jewish custom, in Jewish thought, Basically, he was saying, Dad, I wish you were dead. I want my money. That's what he was saying. That the property that he had coming to him, his inheritance, was more important to him than his father. There was no relationship there. Now, under Jewish law, the elder son gets 2/3 of the inheritance, and the younger son gets 1/3. And the people that were listening to this would have been on the edge of their seat, because there were a lot of things the father could have done. A lot of things that they would have expected, the hearers would have expected the father to do. At the very least, they would have expected the father to punish the child. But in Deuteronomy, the father would have well been within his rights to drag him to the town, the village, and have the elder stone his son. Because under Jewish law, if you have a rebellious son that won't stand the correction of his parents, they were told to bring him to the elders of the village and have him stoned and purge the evil out of the village. Now, just to be clear, there's no actual record of that ever happening. But, within his rights. At the very least, the father could have publicly slapped the son, thereby disowning him. At the very least. Any of these things the listeners would have expected. But what they didn't expect is what happens in the story next. It says that the father divided his inheritance among them. Now, while we take that for granted with the prodigal son got his inheritance, remembering that that's only 1/3. But it says he divided his inheritance among them, which means that the oldest son got his inheritance too. This also would have been shocking to those that heard it, because in Jewish families, the eldest son was the peacemaker. He was the one that would ensure that when there's a family squabble, he was basically the mediator. What the hearers would have expected of the older son is to go between the father and the youngest son and say, hey, come on guys, we can work this out. At the very least, they would have expected the older brother to go to his younger brother and set him straight. But that's not what happened. The older brother quietly says nothing and accepts his inheritance, his 2/3. Now, kind of get a better picture of this, we need to understand just a little bit about inheritance law. Believe it or not, the Jewish law, both the oral tradition and the written tradition, actually provided for such a scene as this. And every hearer would have known that. It's called the Melchizedek law, and it had to do with inheritance, and the father was well within his rights to execute his will while he was alive. If he were to do that, as he did in this case, that's what he did. He executed his will while he was living. In that particular instance, then all ownership transferred to the sons, but the father got to maintain basically a trust, control. However, he could not sell anything, because if he sold it, it belonged to the sons. The sons could not sell it outright. If they did, as the younger son did, then the person purchasing would not receive it until after the father had passed away. Needless to say, that didn't happen very often. But if it did, it was always sold at an extreme discount. So not only did the younger son sell off his inheritance, he sold it to be able to sell it at a discount so that he could run away from home. When Jesus says he went to a far country, there was a Jewish euphemism. That's what they called all Gentile countries. Could have been Athens, could have been Rome. In our vernacular, let's just say he got all his money and he went to Vegas. The son took his money. He said, I don't want any part of my father. I don't want to live in his house. I don't want to have any of his rules. I'm sick to death of this. I'm going to Vegas. And that's what he does. He wants nothing but a good time. Anybody remember that old rock song? Nothing but a good time? I think it was Whitesnake, maybe? What, Poison? I don't know. Anyway. He doesn't want to have anything but a good time. That's what he wants to do. He doesn't want to follow his father's rules. He doesn't want to do anything. He wants to go. And go he does. At this point, the hearers of Jesus' story are both shocked and appalled. And it didn't matter whether they were the sinners or the tax collectors or the Pharisees. They were Jewish people. This was shocking because there are three major actors in this story. Jesus is blowing their minds by taking what they expect to have happen and turning it upside down. That was like Jesus, wasn't it? He takes the stories and turns it upside down. So the younger son goes to Vegas with his money and he lives the life of a playboy until all of his money runs out. Apparently doesn't have any real job skills because he can't get a job, and then the famine hits the land on top of everything else. When a famine hits the land, you go hungry. If you ain't got no money or friends, he has no family support system. He's there by himself. And let me tell you something. Anti-Semitism amongst the Gentile worlds were pretty high. I'd be willing to bet if the situation had presented itself and he was out carousing and drinking, what cost the local people, $1 denarii, probably cost him 5. He's just a little Jewish boy, young, unexperienced, didn't know anything about the world. He's out there sowing his oats, wasting his money. Meanwhile, the unexpected, exceptional, extravagant generosity of the father to go ahead and honor the younger son's request. And the older brother continuously is working about his business, following his rules. But wait, that relationship's broken too, isn't it? See, the older brother indicates to us later that he's been following the rules. I've followed all your commandments. I'm doing my job. I've got it all down, and you're not doing any favor to me. Well, wait a minute. He just gave him 2/3 of everything he owed. It seems that both brothers' relationship with their father, there was not a loving relationship, but instead they looked at their father as more of the banker. The older son was doing what he should, when he should, but his heart wasn't in it. There was no relationship with the father. The younger son, he takes all of his stuff and he runs off. And we can infer by the story that every day the Father's looking down the road, hoping someday, somehow, He returns. But understand this, because of what the young son did, as far as the family and as far as the village that they lived in would be concerned, this boy would be dead. The father is not exaggerating. Yes, they didn't have him stoned, but because of his request of his father, his insubordination, he would have had to answer not just to the father, but to the entire village. Because what he did was dishonorable. What he did was wrong. So the father is not exaggerating when he said, "This my son was dead." And so as we go further down this parable and we see about the famine, and he becomes hungry, he's got no money. It says he attaches himself to a citizen of that country, a Gentile. Most Gentiles didn't care much for the Jews at all. So whoever this citizen was, he could have cared less about the kid. For him, in the middle of a famine, it was more important that his pigs get taken care of. And maybe, just maybe, he did that because can you think of any worse job for a young Jewish boy than feeding pigs? They were unclean animals. And then we come a little bit further down. It says he desired to eat the husk that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. The husk that they're talking about, according to tradition, was called carob husk. That's what they gave the pigs to eat. Carob husk were considered the food of the poor. In other words, when you had nothing else to eat, you ate carob. In fact, in Isaiah, it's actually mentioned that when times are prosperous, it's difficult for the people to remember God, but when they are in need and want food, they repent and seek Him. And when the people are desperate, they will seek to eat carob to survive. The people sitting around Jesus would have known this. You see how Jesus is painting a whole picture using everything that they know to relate to them. This parable has often been misused to say that he was advancing an attack on the Pharisees, and that's not true. While he was attacked and did attack several times individual Pharisees for their hypocritical stance, he never attacked the Pharisaical religion. In fact, what he told the people is do what they tell you to do, just don't act like they did. See, he chastised the individual Pharisees' attitudes and actions, but he never chastised their beliefs. He's making a point. And this parable makes the same point. And that point is just as relevant today as it was when Jesus was to bring the listeners into it, that they were able to identify with one of these sons. Either the son that took all and was insulting to his father and took all he could and went and blew it in the far country, or of the other son, who was there, went to synagogue, followed all the commandments to the best of his ability, but his heart wasn't in it. He was there for the wrong motives, for the wrong reasons. He had no relationship with his father any more than the younger son did. And yet we have a father who extravagantly waits and loves his children. You see, that's what this parable is about. The parable is about the Father, God. And you will find yourself in one of these two camps. And the whole point to the parable is that no matter which camp you find yourself in, there is love and forgiveness and acceptance for you. But you've got to want it. Well, that's about all the time we have. We're going to wrap this up next week as we get a little bit further into this parable. But do you see why it's important to understand it the way they heard it? Because it's so much more deeper than theologians can stretch a thing out and make it mean that what it doesn't mean at all. There's been so many different theological things on this, but the ultimate is the way Jesus told it. It was applicable to the Jews. And unless you understand it the way they understood it, because you see, forgiveness and acceptance was a Pharisee taught religion, part of the religion, Judaism. They understood forgiveness and acceptance and repentance. But the problem was that somewhere along the way, their confidence became in their religion, in themselves. My church has it right. Those people out there, they're not even trying. They don't deserve God. That was the attitude. And so, Jesus tells his story to get their attention, to get them to understand that this story is about a family. Albeit a dysfunctional one. But then aren't most families at least a little dysfunctional? But the Father doesn't care. The Father shows love and grace to both children. But only one of them refused to accept it. That's what we'll talk about next week. I hope you see, as we are studying some of these, the difference and the impact that it can make when you understand things the way the people Jesus was talking to understand them. Because it's a whole big realm, and it's something I've taught you since I've been here, that don't take my word, don't take any preacher's word. Check it out for yourselves. Read, study, because this parable is one of the examples of one that's been twisted over and over and over again to mean something completely different than what Jesus intended.